This movie is to help you with the bee's knees ladies knee sock pattern. It is not the pattern itself. This time I really could not just give it to you in one video because of the enormous variation in sizes. It turns out that normal women have calves anywhere from 12.5 to 20 inches in circumference. And all of those sizes of calf may be associated with anywhere from size 5 to 12 shoe size. I'll show you the various skills involved in this video, and then there are two ways for you to get the actual pattern. I have published it, and the link for you to buy it will be in the program notes. Also, in 2023 or 2024, a version of it will appear in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. A quick overview comparing this to a normal sock. Normally, we start at the top, knit some ribbing, usually one by one, but it can be something else. Then, if we're going to knit the leg or the ankle portion of the sock tubular, we move all the ribbing stitches to one bed, lift half of it, rotate it around, and hang it on the second bed. Then we continue knitting on down the leg to the foot, all tubular. For this pattern, we are knitting tubular, and we are going to have ribbing at the top. There are a couple of differences, however. This ribbing is double the normal length because it's meant to fold over. That's to give a good, strong sock top. And there is enough ribbing here to encircle the entire calf, which is likely to be almost twice the measurement, sometimes more than twice, that the foot is. The worry that I hear most often from knitters concerning sock knitting is the difficulty of transferring that ribbing, rotating it around, and hanging it on the other bed. And since there is so much of it in this pattern, I have used an alternate method. However, if you're good at that transfer, you may start with ribbing. Instead, here's how I'm recommending it in the pattern. You'll be given a span of needles to set up for work. This is a fictitious size of sock, not any real one. Cast on with waste yarn in tubular knitting, and I find it easier to cast on using every other needle, and since this is just waste yarn, we can fix that later. Set up to make your zigzag row and knit across. You should use a very small stitch size for the zigzag row, and your carriage should be set for normal knitting, both carriages or locks, whatever they're called on your machine. In this case, on the Superba, this is the normal knitting setting. After the zigzag row, set both locks or carriages for tubular knitting. Remove the wire from the cast-on comb, push it up through that zigzag, and reinsert the wire. Make sure the comb drops down and add some weight. And it varies machine to machine exactly how much weight you're going to need. Double check that you're on tubular settings, increase to main stitch size, and knit 2 rounds. That first couple of rows was a little stiff for me. That led me to discover I needed a little bit more weight. Now move all of the needles across the span in use into working position. They should now oppose perfectly. If all came out, they would hit each other. And knit a few waste yarn rows. You may find that you need a little bit more weight at the edges. One of my weights is homemade, and it's described in my Cool Tools and Cheap Tricks books. The other is a passive heel grip. Ideally, you want at least 2 inches of waste yarn. I didn't actually achieve that because I'm using odds and ends of yarn, and mine broke. But for this demo, I'll make do. We're still knitting tubular. Leave all the settings the same, but change over to the main yarn, and it can help to put an electrical clip or a clothespin on the end of the main yarn so that the first stitch of the real knitting doesn't want to jump off the machine. And then we will go right into knitting the leg of the sock. We're starting at the top and knitting downward towards the heel, which means a lot of decreasing. Begin by setting the row counter to 0. Knit the first row carefully to make sure everything knits off. And I found at this point that I needed more weight. Now the pattern is going to tell you to knit a certain number of rows and then make decreases, and to do that a certain number of times. And this is where the variation in the sizes is really dramatic. The number of rows between the number of decreases may be enormously different, and the number of decreases may, depending on whether you're starting with a wide calf and going to a small foot or the other way around. There are two entirely acceptable ways to decrease. In one case, we'll just move over the outer stitch on each bed, on each side of each bed, with a single prong tool. In the other case, we'll use a double or even a triple prong tool to move either 2 or 3 stitches over. But the key thing is every single time decrease 1 stitch on each end of each bed, and every single time take abundant care to make sure that your stitches are correctly seated before resuming tubular knitting. We'll do this for quite a while down the sock top, and by the time we reach the ankle area, we'll be at the target number of stitches for the foot and stop decreasing and knit a few rows for the ankle. I'm doing a single decrease down the left side and a double down the right side so that in a minute you can compare them. Double is on the left, single is on the right. They look quite different, but they both look nice, and equally important, they are both very comfortable. On a European double bed machine, you may knit the heel on either bed, and I find it easier to do so on the front bed. On any machine, you are going to need some extra weight. I'm using my heavy fork, and in a minute I'll add a heel grip, and I am putting them on the front bed and hanging it on the front bed fabric only. There are multiple methods of short rowing, which is what we're about to do. I'm doing the automatic wrap. If you prefer the true wrap, you may use it, and I will have more detailed videos for both PASSIP and Japanese machines as separate videos. Basically, we're doing the same thing on every single machine. However, I find the specifics of the techniques, some work better on one machine and some on another. Here's something to always watch for. If you don't quite have enough weight correctly placed, you will tend to lose a stitch. So I'm using a transfer tool just to help me hold down that stitch, get it reknitted where it tried to drop and reseated, then replacing the weights in a new position that's directly under the needles that are still knitting, and proceeding. In this case, I go knit across, place a needle and hold, knit across, place a needle and hold, and that's the automatic wrap. And I don't usually do more than 4 rows without changing the position of the weights. That is critical to success. In the pattern, you will be given a specific number of stitches down to which we short row. And for the automatic wrap, that means after the last of the held needles is placed in hold, there should be a certain number remaining. This is short rowing in, and we normally short row down until about 1/3 of the needles are at work. In this case, they didn't divide into even thirds. And one pattern might tell you to short row down to 8, another might tell you to short row down to 10. I went down to 10. When it's time to short row out, we begin returning 1 needle to work on the side away from where the carriage is at present, and continue doing that until all have knitted once. While short rowing out, you may find it necessary to reposition your weights the same as we did while short rowing in, although I find I don't have to do it quite as often while short rowing out. Keep on going until all of the needles on the front bed or wherever the heel's being made have knitted 1 time. And now here's how to avoid holes in the heels. It's one of several methods. Lift the purl bump on the front knitting from the row below the final row and place it on the back edge needle, one that already holds a stitch. Do this on both sides of the work and make absolutely certain that both stitches are neatly seated. I find a dental pick style tool easier to use for this project then I do a prong tool. Now close the beds back up, and we're ready to knit down the length of the foot, knitting tubular once again. The pattern will specify a number of rows to knit, and because I'm just doing a demo here, I'm not going to knit very many. Now we move on to the toe, which can be a repeat of the heel, or it can be this. We can use the same number of rows to decrease, and we can either do it with a 2-prong tool or a 1-prong tool, just as we did while decreasing down the leg. Personally, I like both toes equally well, and surprisingly, they fit about the same. If you use the decreased toe, you won't have as much kitchenering to do, and I will shortly show you a way that you can avoid having any kitchenering to do. The decreases are worked on each side of each bed every other row until you get down to the same number of stitches as existed on the smallest or shortest heel row. After the final decrease, knit 2 more rows, which is really just 1 round, and then either scrap off or you may transfer all the stitches to one bed and bind off. Yes, the bind off creates a little ridge. I have found that surprisingly, it hardly ever bothers anybody because it's sitting right there at the tip of your toes, and most of the time, our shoes don't touch the tips of our toes, so there's a little room for it to sit there politely. I'm doing a manual version of the transfer bind off here. If you scrapped off, you would do at least 2 inches worth of waste yarn knitting, then turn it to the inside of the toe, Kitchener stitch these few toe stitches together, and remove the waste yarn. Here's our little mini foot section of the sock. Just as on the leg, I did a simple decrease on one side, and that's what it looks like, and a full fashion decrease on the other side, and that's what it looks like. I actually think that the simple version makes a little bit sturdier of a toe, and you don't have to do the same one on the sock top as you do on the sock bottom. Now we release our sock from the comb, and you would slit open the zigzag row on the waste yarn to rehang the top of the sock on the machine to create your ribbing. Start the ribbing by looking at the inside of the sock tube and hanging half of the stitches from the main yarn onto the back or main bed. Zooming in, you can see that the red stitches are main yarn stitches, and the gray is my waste yarn. This is how it should look when hung. The remainder of the waste yarn that was at the top of the sock is pushed down behind the knit side of the knitting, and make sure that it is out of the way before proceeding. Now transfer the main yarn stitches that have just been hung so as to be ready to knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. Every other stitch goes on the front or ribber bed. On the left, I've completed this operation. On the right, I'm still working on it. Set both carriages to knit normally. Reduce the stitch size to 2 to 3 whole numbers beneath the main stitch size, the stockinette stitch size, and knit your ribbing rows. Then either scrap off or bind off and repeat for the other half of the sock top. This is what each half will look like once it comes off of the machine. There's still waste yarn attached. Here's where the waste yarn attaches on the inside of the sock. If you used a ravel cord, you're looking at the ravel cord and you can just pull it out. If you did not, which I didn't, you can snip this in a few places and pull it right on out. When the sock comes off of the machine, this is likely how it will look. Here's the waste yarn still attached where we cast on originally in waste yarn so as to work down the leg. And here's the waste yarn where I scrapped off. If you bound off immediately, you won't have that. I found that my first attempt to guess how loose a bind off I needed, I overdid it. It was too loose. So in the future, I scrapped off and chain stitched through the live stitches with the work in my lap, where I could hold it and stretch it and get a real idea of what I wanted. Either approach is fine. You just want a bind off that looks nice and also stretches enough to get the sock off and on easily. The final step is to sew the 2 pieces of ribbing together, and you're done. The foot is a completely traditional foot shape, and here it is.